got here on time yesterday. When I first got invited to this, the emphasis of the talk and what you kind of invited me to talk about was that paper that came out in Fisheries in 2012, looking at angler behavior using the internet. And what I've done for my PhD research and some of the research with Chizinski and Kevin Pope at University of Nebraska is kind of look at different ways we can take angler research and kind of not really change, but improve on our current protocols that we're typically doing in our systems. So all of you know we typically gather just our angler data based on interviews with anglers, going out, measuring their fish they catch, going out and counting anglers. And this gives us a really good idea of just how much effort, how much catch and harvest is going on. But there is a potential to gather a lot more data for these systems that we are not currently at least utilizing. Nielsen in 1999, a little bit earlier, defined fishery management at least as this overlap of these three circles: organisms, biota or habitat, and people. And this could also be conceptualized as kind of a fishery where all three of these things happen together. There are also a lot of other things that happen outside of that three overlapping circles that affect a fishery, though. Some big things that came about recently that are, I'm sure, a big factor in New York as well. This was climate change and its potential impacts on ecosystem function. One that we don't really think about a lot, but perhaps societal valuation of natural resources, changes that people are no longer valuing that going out on a fishing trip as much as they were, say, 50 years ago. And then perhaps the biggest thing for this talk is changes in information and technology that anglers have available to them to be able to access and share information among themselves. Maybe. Okay. Can you hear me at all back there? Okay. I'll try to do it kind of up here. So in 2011, Dr. Pope and I kind of reconceptualized what we consider a regional fishery, at least, in which habitat and organisms are tightly linked together in circles, and then there are multiple sets of those water bodies within a region. And then outside of that region is society as a whole, not just anglers. This society as a whole, of course, is made up of different types of anglers, which we have a fairly good handle on from angler typology. But this society outside of that is what we don't really have an understanding of what the influence is on our fisheries. Those anglers, or those non-anglers, I guess, in some cases, do have an impact on our fisheries in that they do talk to our legislators, they do talk to our commissioners, they do talk to the people that make rules for our states. So in traditional fisheries management with creel surveys and angler surveys, we typically just focus on those on-site surveys, focusing just on those individual lake habitats and individual lake surveys. But the real question is, how do we get at these surveys that we can start gathering information on this huge scale of society in general? And this transition from these in-lake surveys to these larger surveys encompasses getting at different types of anglers that we don't typically survey with these on-lake surveys. Like perhaps this group of anglers that I don't know where they're fishing in this puddle, but apparently they like it. Perhaps anglers that are fishing using illegal methods in states, such as noodling in some states. Ice fishing, I don't know, perhaps New York does a better job of creeling it, but in Nebraska it's a very overlooked portion of our fishery that we don't assess with creels. But really what I'm getting at here is that maybe we need to start thinking outside the box with these creels. We've been doing angler surveys, kind of the traditional go out, count people, interview people for the last 40 to 60 years, and haven't really made any huge improvements in that methodology in that time period. So as we start thinking about how to do this, we start thinking about how anglers have changed the way that they share information among each other throughout this time period as well. Anglers traditionally would go to the bait shop or the coffee shop, sit down, have a cup of coffee, go buy their minnows. They would talk about where they were fishing, what they were doing, how well they were doing. That still exists some today with the older generation probably, but for a lot of anglers, now this information is shared online. A lot of people just go talk about it on a fishing forum. There are a lot of these apps now that people can just go put in their information about what and brag about their catches. So a lot of anglers are using this information to gather, these techniques to gather information too. So the real question is, how do we kind of harness these tools and gather the information from them? The Recreational Boating and Fishing Foundation in 2011 did a study looking at internet use by anglers for sharing information with about their experiences. Casual anglers, as they defined them, typically shared experiences using Facebook and Twitter, whereas more avid anglers, so anglers that are out there more often, looking for a little more in-depth information, are more typically using forums and blogs to share information. So this very different type of information exchange between Facebook and Twitter and then forums and blogs requires us to give it some thought into what type of anglers we're seeking out for these analyses as well. So to gather information off the internet, there are a couple of ways out there that I've been exploring, at least in Nebraska, on how to gain information. This paper that Brian mentioned was published in Fisheries in 2012, in which we used Google Insights for search to look at fishing-related terms. And what Google Insights for search does is it allows you to go in, put a search term in, and then it will tell you, it will give you a relative search volume for how often that term has been searched for since 2004 until the present. And I'll go through some examples of what I mean by that. So, but there is one caveat to this technology. As with all web-based technology especially, this technology is changing. Google changed their algorithm that they calculate this with after I published this paper, and now it is called Google Trends. It's no longer Google Insights for search. So if you try to find that, go to Google Trends when you're looking for it. So yeah, this shows up pretty good. This is a screenshot of Google Trends in this case. At the very top, there is it says worldwide. There's some filters you can select, so you can leave it worldwide, so it has all of Google searches in it. You can restrict it down to just the US. There's time periods, there's categories you can restrict. You can add different terms. So in this case, I have the term fishing. So this would be searches for anything related to fishing in the title of the search. And here in the middle, there's a graph of relative search volume over time from 2004 to the present. And I just conducted this like last week, so it's up to the week. And these are weekly search volumes. So the one thing I want you to know is that this number that it presents is a relative number, so there's actually a maximum of 100, which is behind that February 2004 box there, but it is there. And then the other thing I want you to note is that you can get these news headlines that for some instances, if you go down to smaller terms, not just fishing, they're actually very indicative of what's happening in the world and what is happening to cause people to search. These letters represent the news headlines that Google thinks might be affecting these, but in this case, they just happen to coincide with the peaks in annual searches for fishing. But then at the bottom of the page, you can get these, the maps of regional interest. You can get it at a worldwide scale or a US scale. So So let's focus in just on the U.S. for a minute. I did a search on the U.S. These are monthly means for this weekly data is too crazy on the graph, but these are monthly means of searches for fishing. They have, you can see that it follows kind of the general trend that you would expect for fishing effort within the U.S., where there's fairly low effort in the winter as a whole for the U.S., and then it peaks in the summer months. If we take a look at just 1 year in general, 2012, you can see that general trend of a peak, just like I was talking about. But then you can also start to tease apart other things like this period right here, which is most likely either ice fishing or like a spawning season, spawning opening for walleye perhaps in Wisconsin and Minnesota, that area. And you can really start to tease that apart whenever you look at different states and type in the like New York fishing, and I'll get to it in a second, or like if you typed in Texas fishing, this would be essentially a straight line because they don't really have the seasonality that we have in the north. But so I changed this. This is originally Nebraska fishing in my original talks, but changed it to New York so you guys can get a look at what's going on here. New York fishing, if you type that word in, you can see it's the same kind of general decline that we've seen in the national data for interest over time from Google. Kind of matches up really well with the national survey data from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as well. We're just kind of seeing this general decline in fishing effort or fishing interest through time. The one nice thing about doing it on a national scale is that you can start to see these patterns of where people are searching for New York fishing in this case, where people are searching out that information from. Now in this case, once again, this is all based on a relative search volume. So the number of searches happening for New York fishing inside New York State is a huge number. So it kind of mutes out everything else just because there's a ton of them happening there. But you can also tell, and this shows up more dramatically in other states, but you can also show that, at least from a marketing perspective, that sometimes a year are better to target out-of-state audiences because perhaps in this case, in July through November, the only searches that are going on are from New York. But in January through June, in both 2011 and 2012, you're also getting searches for New York fishing from Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. And then there are some other states that have very few searches for them outside of that. So this can also not just be used as kind of a gauge of effort, but it also is important to note that it can be used as a very good marketing tool at a statewide level. So like I mentioned before, it does trend very well with the national survey data from the Fish and Wildlife Service. I just have plotted here the last 3 points, the 2001, 2006, and 2011 surveys, and thousands of anglers, so 34 million. But if you just look at those 3 points, you get why people say the decline. But if you plot essentially over that relative search volume from those from 2004 to 2012, when that data was available, you can see that it pretty much matches what that regression line would be through that, except that you also get this nice annual fluctuation. You also get this much finer spatial, temporal in this case, but you also are getting that spatial scale in there as well. Yeah. So there are some other caveats to this. Fishing guide is a term that Nebraska uses for their regulation book. I'm not sure what Nebraska or New York calls theirs, regulations or. But they use the term fishing guide, and we were going through looking at these terms in Google Insights at that point, and this could be kind of used as a marketing tool from a state agency level, and as to how to reach your anglers, because whenever you start looking at fishing guide and you look at the results for Google Insights, the very bottom of that page, it shows you related searches. Well, one of the things that comes up is the TV genre, for fishing guide, so fishing guide shows. But then if you actually go to Google and just do a fishing guide search, the first thing that comes up is not Nebraska's fishing guide or any state's fishing guide. It's a World of Warcraft fishing level guide on how to get from level 1 to level 600 in World of Warcraft fishing. Didn't even know there was fishing in World of Warcraft, but then the next one is an actual fishing guide that you're paying, which makes sense. And then like 5 down the list is Nebraska's guide. So clearly this is not really an effective marketing name for their regulations if someone's actually seeking this regulations book. So there is this potential to gather information on large spatial and temporal scales with much lower costs than actually doing a national level survey. But there are those caveats that need to be addressed with it. So if we take a step down, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my PhD work now, focusing in on a regional scale. And I worked in the Salt Valley region of Nebraska, and what I wanted to do there is look at information that I could gather from a fishing forum in the region and relate that back to effort that I observed within the region. So I have posts to the online fishing forum, and then also information or actual number of hours counted or estimated effort at each individual lake. And I wanted to see if we could perhaps on a regional scale just go out and look at the information online and then get a good relative index of effort at these lakes. So just for reference, the Salt Valley region of Nebraska I'm talking about is located in the southeastern corner of Nebraska. It's centered around Lincoln, Nebraska, so it's got a fairly good population base there. So there's a lot of anglers that use these lakes, quite a bit of pressure. So on the y-axis here I have annual effort in hours, annual posts, so this is the total number of, or total hours during the year at each lake and the total number of posts about each lake in a year. So if you just do a straight correlation among those, the correlation is quite strong, 0.96 with the p-value of less than 0.01, indicating that just on a relative basis at least, we can go out and look at, or just go sit at our computers, count how many posts there are about individual lakes, and then at least use that to relatively compare effort about the lakes in this system. If we take that one step further from the regional, just spatial, to a temporal aspect, and this is monthly effort, so just on a month, all the hours counted, all the hours estimated for all the reservoirs, all the posts for all the reservoirs on a monthly scale. You can also see it's a fairly strong correlation in this case as well. So this really has some implications in whether or not, or in how we can at least gather data on a regional scale without having to go out and creel or survey at every single water body. So in this case, we have the potential to gather this regional level information much cheaper and faster than we can in the past. And the one point I want to make here is that this is all done on effort, but I do think there's a possibility to go to catch level data, maybe harvest level data with this, and that people share a lot of information about catch levels on these forums as well. So shifting to what we could gain from an individual interview type situations. One thing I wanted to look at within the Salt Valley region of Nebraska is how we can take information from our in-person surveys and tweak it just a little bit to gather a whole bunch more information on the regional scale. So one question that we ask, and which we don't typically ask in our state level surveys, is what zip code are you coming from? Seems like a very simple question. We don't typically ask it in Nebraska, but now we do. But from that, we can get travel distance, which is fairly simple to calculate. You don't gain a lot from it, but in this case, you get an estimate of cost or relative cost. In this case, these are my reservoirs in the system, box plots of travel distance, just to show you that they vary quite a bit among reservoirs. But the really interesting thing from that is once you start getting anglers telling you where they're coming from, you can start adopting other techniques. So I adopted a technique, kernel density home range analysis from wildlife, in which essentially what we're doing is taking a lake and treating each angler as a relocation of that lake. So it's essentially kind of the flipped version of what a telemetry project would do for wildlife, because you can't really easily take a radio collar and put it on a person. But we're not far from that, and I want to make that point clear, because how many of you have smartphones? It's possible that with apps that we could develop to track fishing, we're not far from that, being able to actually do this on an individual angler level. So the way this works is the red, or the kind of purplish dot here is the lake, and then each individual zip code that anglers visited from is a green dot, and there is no density in this or frequency in this graph presented. But you can start at least seeing a spatial distribution of where the anglers came from. If we take this the next step further and do a kernel density estimate on it, we can see that there's big variations in where these anglers come from, depending on which lake you're at. I just have two graphed here. Holmes on the left is my smallest, or it's not smallest, it's my urban reservoir, so it makes sense that the very small area that it's drawing from, basically just the city, like inside the city limits it's drawing from. Branched Oak on the right is my largest reservoir. It's drawing from a much larger area. So from this you would think that just maybe water body size is drawing a big factor in how far people are coming from, where they're going. But if you really just take a look at all 19 of the water bodies, the names aren't meaningful here, but what I really want to point out is just the amount of variation in how far anglers either are willing to travel to get to these lakes or are not willing to travel, I guess, because you can also think about it as for perhaps the second one from the right, or top row and the second one, killdeer, that the anglers that aren't in that blue area are just not willing to travel to that lake. So you can kind of think of it as the opposite way as well. But once you get this on an individual lake scale, the real benefit of this, in my eyes, is that you can start overlaying all these, and then you can see on a regional scale areas that we're doing a very good job of recruiting anglers from, areas that we are perhaps overutilizing, and that we are really gathering a lot of anglers from the city of Lincoln, which makes sense, because then you start, the other side of this equation is that you need to add in the population base. The darker reds here indicate more dense populations. So the two areas of dense populations in this are they're in the center of the city of Lincoln, and then up in the upper right is Omaha, which we draw some from, but there's also other fishing opportunities there. The real area of interest to me from a regional fishery scale or perspective is this area, because there's not a huge population down here, but there's also no fishing resources. So these people are just not making the effort to drive to the Salt Valley, which is about an hour away.